This video features a 1984 Evinrude 15 horsepower water pump check or replacement. Let's get to it. First thing you're going to want to do is tilt the motor up, lock it securely in place. We're going to focus in on these 3 bolts on port and starboard. First thing I'm going to do is loosen up these 3 bolts, port and starboard. I'm using a 1/4 inch drive ratchet with a 3/8 deep socket. It gives me the best angle to get to these bolts. Now that those bolts are out, this lower unit is trying to come off a little bit. What I'm going to show you here in a minute is right in this area here is your shift linkage. We're going to work the shifter mechanism back and forth a little bit and kind of wiggle this until we can expose a bolt. There's a flathead groove cut in the top of that bolt for a flathead screwdriver, and that's how we're going to access that. This is what I mean by working the shifting mechanism. I'm going to wiggle this around a little bit. I'm going to work on this. Forward gear gives you the most leeway that you can get out of this. So you'll want this in the forward gear position, and you'll want to crack in between the lower unit and your midsection about this much. With the 2 casings split apart, you can see this bolt right here. It has a flat cut in it for a flathead screwdriver. We're going to loosen that up and remove it. Right when I get to the very end of the threads, I'm going to use a pair of needle nose pliers to get down inside here and pull that loose. When that bolt comes out, keep in mind that there is a bit of a lock washer with it as well. You'll want to keep track of that. You don't want to lose it when you go to reassemble it. At this point, my lower unit is separated and my shift linkage is disconnected. At this point, I should be able to slide the lower unit out. Just like that. Now with the lower unit off, the water pump housing is exposed. This whole black unit here is the water pump housing. There are 4 bolts that hold it on. I'm going to use a 1/4 drive ratchet with a 7/16 deep socket for this process. Now with all the bolts removed, I'm going to take this housing. Sometimes they stick a little. I'm just going to kind of pull it up ever so slightly. I'm going to try to hold the drive shaft in its place while I do that. I don't want to pull the drive shaft out with everything just yet. So I'm going to pull this out. And pull this out. This is your water pump impeller. It's a soft rubber. It's got a bit of flex to it, and that's normal. What you're looking for on this are any chunks of rubber missing or any cracks. If it has either one of those things going on, it has to be replaced. Generally speaking, you want to replace these probably about every 2 years, give or take, depending on how many hours you put on your motor. But a good rule of thumb is to check them at least once a year. At this point, you can pull your drive shaft out of the lower gearbox. This plate comes off, and it's part of the water pump assembly. This is your drive shaft with the water pump assembly spread out along the drive shaft so you can see the order that it needs to be placed in. There's a few things going on with the top of the housing here. There's an O-ring right here. You want to check, make sure that it looks good. There's also a seal between the shaft and the water pump housing. You want to make sure that that seems reasonable. You can usually feel its resistance as you slide it up and down the shaft. If I think the seal is in good shape, I'm not going to remove that from the shaft in fear I may damage that seal, raking it over the splines on either end of this shaft. So right now I'm just going to leave that all on there. If you're doing a complete replacement, obviously you have to take it off, but if you're just doing a check, I would just leave it on there. Also, there's a rubber grommet right here. This plugs into the top of the water pump housing. This connects to the line that runs up and supplies your engine with water. You want to make sure that that looks like it's in good shape and not cracked or dry rotted. Now on the underside, or the inside of the water pump housing on the upper end, there's a steel cup that goes into this, but there is a cutout right here that marries up to this tip on the flange of this. So when you put it all back together, you want to make sure that that is nested down into that, like that. Now on the drive shaft to the water impeller itself, there is a key in here. And you'll want to make sure that if you remove this, be very careful, because as soon as I move this up or down, that key is going to fall out. And it's pretty small, you don't want to lose it. So just keep in mind, if you are replacing this completely, when you pull that out, don't lose that key. Also, in this case, this is a 1-year-old impeller. It has flex to it, and that's perfectly fine. You just really don't want any cracks, dry rot, chunks of rubber missing, any of that nature. Also, if this is a new installation, take a picture of it right like it is now in relation to one of the splines, either the upper or the lower. Notice how these are flexed. If this were a brand new water impeller, these fins would be pulling straight out. When you go to put it back into this cup unit, you will have to flex these ever so slightly to get it to fit inside of this. You'll want this rotation and the flex direction to go with the rotation of the engine. This shaft only rotates one direction regardless if it's in forward gear or reverse gear. That happens in the lower unit independent from this shaft. This shaft will always turn in this direction. If this were a brand new impeller, what I've done in the past is I'll put some Dawn dish soap on it. Do not use any petroleum-based product, but use Dawn dish detergent. Lather that all up really nice, maybe even a zip tie, and you can wrap the zip tie around this and slowly tighten it and rotate it until you can get these fins to rotate ever so slightly, and then you'll be able to feed it inside of this cup. Once it gets to a certain point, you cut the zip tie off, pull the zip tie out, reassemble all of this. When you go to reassemble this plate and its hole pattern is oblonged in such a way that you cannot put it on there an incorrect position. So if the holes don't line up, just keep turning it until they do, and you will find your hole pattern. When reassembling this, these splines will have to marry up to the splines inside of the lower unit. So we're going to set this down in here. We're going to do essentially the same thing we did before. Make sure that those hole pattern matches up with everything correctly. When I'm putting this all back together, something I like to do is put anti-seize on these threads. This is a part that you're probably going to take apart yearly, and you don't want the bolts to start seizing up inside of the threads. Also, keep in mind, these bolts do not need to be crazy tight. I'm sure you can find some torque settings somewhere, but I'm using a 1/4 inch drive ratchet for most of this work, and I'm using that on purpose so that I don't get too much leverage on any one part of this. You over tighten these bolts and righty-tighty turns into righty-loosey pretty quickly. I'm also going to tighten this in a cross pattern just to make sure that the entire pump marries flat down to its mating surface without anything rocking. It's also just good habit anytime you have a bolt pattern to cross over. It's just anything you do, wheels, outboard motors, whatever the case. That's it. That's all I'm going to tighten her down to. And like I said, this is a 1/4 inch ratchet. I don't have a ton of leverage on this thing, and I'm not getting too carried away with it either. Now here comes the fun bit. We're going to put this lower unit back in its home. This is the tube that goes into that soft rubber grommet on top of the water pump. This is what feeds your engine water from the pump. This is where the drive shaft recesses into. There are splines on the end of the shaft, and there are splines on the corresponding side inside the motor. You will have to align those splines for everything to go back into its place. If you don't, you're going to feel resistance. You're never going to get the two lower unit and upper unit married back together. This is your shift shaft. Let's get to it. Now, as I realign everything, I'm going to be ever so careful not to force anything. I'm going to work really hard on making sure that my water line meets up with my water pump grommet, and my shift linkage marries back up into its brass setting. Now, if I'm having troubles getting this all aligned at this point, I'm just going to keep wiggling it. But at some point, you may have to pull your starter just a little bit to turn the engine enough for those splines inside the lower unit to meet back up with the drive shaft. See that indentation right there? That is being held in place by this bolt, like that, inside of that brass. Make sure that your shifting lever mechanism shaft fits inside of that hole, and that you can see a round hole in there before you try to put your bolt in there. If it's not in there all the way when you put your bolt in, your linkage will not be connected. I now have most of that aligned and put back together. I'm going to use this tool here, which pinches down here and it extends right here to be able to grab the bolt that goes inside of the shifting mechanism, like that. It's hard to get in there, and I found that this helps a lot. A pair of needle nose pliers may do the trick as well. I now have that lower unit shifting linkage connected, and everything is aligned. I'm just going to kind of gently massage this back into place. You can also use your shifting linkage to help you pull it. As you go in reverse, it will suck the 2 units together ever so slightly. And you can help yourself by using your shifting linkage a little bit on that. Quick tip, when you're tightening these bolts up, you'll want to make sure that you start all of these bolts with your fingers to make sure you're capturing the threads correctly. And you'll want to start all 6 bolts before you tighten anything down. That way you can get your alignment right on everything. Once you're finished tightening these down, you can go ahead and lower the motor back down and give your shift linkage. Make sure everything works properly before you try to start it. That concludes my video. If you like what you see, give me a like, maybe a subscribe. I'd appreciate it. I'll keep doing more videos like this. Thanks for your time.